Welcome to the Plural Positivity World Conference 2020. If you're just fronting, you have joined the start of a conference that is all online with mostly pre-recorded sessions, and we've done our best to make sure everything not live is closed captioned. We are the Crisses, a mainly covert, modular, polyfragmented system with about 20 regular fronts and a cast of 100 or so entities, plus all the Lego Crisses that crop up from time to fill various roles. We are one of the co-organizers of Plural events, and I am your loving opening ceremonies host, just in case. Just in case of what? No, that's my name. I'm just in case. Semi-professional comic relief for the Crisses. We're usually best known for being the system admin and main author for kinhost.org and for our Many Minds on the Issue podcast. The other physically embodied cohort members are Power to the Plural System, the director of the Plural Association, YouTuber, and lead admin of Alternation on Facebook. And our sidekick is the Elephant Journal System, who braved endless transcripts last year and provided giddy efforts at stress relief from Australia in what was the dead middle of their night for weeks before last year's conference. Together we bring you the Plural Positivity World Conference, a collaborative and inclusive venture with participants from throughout the plural community, originally framed as a peaceful protest of exclusion, both by fee and design, of most plurals and clients from the ISSTD's professional conferences. The ISSTD, International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, is the research, psychology, and psychiatry policymakers who claim to be the saviors of our traumagenic cohort. They have just started barely including plural professionals at the table, and we will continue to push for more inclusion of voices throughout the community in the policies and treatment plans that affect so many plurals across the world. Behind the conference is Plural Events, a grassroots effort to coordinate plural community activities. You can visit the website at pluralevents.org, and there you'll see that this is also Plural Acceptance Week, and Saturday, the 18th, is Plural Pride Day. This conference is part of the efforts to celebrate and increase awareness and acceptance of plurality in the world. Plurality, in terms of this conference, is inclusive, and we are gathering to show support for traumagenic and DID-OSDD diagnosed plurals against psychology and psychiatry industry oppression. As the opening remarks host, if you will, it is my responsibility to make sure you know where the bathrooms are. So here's all the disclaimers and background information you need to make sure this is as pleasant an experience as possible. All presentation materials and presenters' opinions are the respective copyright and opinions of their presenters and do not constitute legal, medical, or therapeutic advice. This conference is purely for educational value and to share a wealth of accumulated knowledge being freely offered to the community. Conference volunteers will attempt to screen content and chats as resources and time permits. We are attempting to safely spread good information, but cannot be held responsible for presenter content, live chat content, images or graphics, people's behavior, or how you and perceive the materials presented. This conference cannot be responsible for your and safety. Only you and know your own plural systems, triggers, and issues. Please exercise appropriate self-care and strategize your and recovery plan with trained and licensed professionals. If you need crisis assistance, please seek out a crisis hotline in your area. We are bringing you 7 days of content, and you can check out the schedule of events in the link in the video description or at https://revx.us/schedule. The link is also on several pages, including the homepage at pluralevents.org, if you get lost and can't find us. All times on the schedule are New York or Eastern Daylight Time in the USA, so set your alarms accordingly. There's a time zone converter linked on the first page of the conference schedule. Also, here on YouTube, please make sure to click subscribe and click the bell for notifications below But also note that YouTube limits notifications. You can't get a notification for every presentation, so also use your nearest reminder or calendar application. Ask Siri or Alexa to set you a reminder. Use an egg timer or hotel concierge service. Or write the time for the next session on the back of your hand in eyeliner. You won't want to miss anything, unless you do want to miss it, which is entirely your prerogative. Most sessions on the schedule will say Premiere with Chat, which is what you're in right now. A premiere is like a watch party. The video starts for everyone at the same time, and alongside your video you will find a chat area with presenters, moderators, and attendees babbling alongside the video, which will both distract you and keep your headmates busy while you're watching the video. We'll do our best to keep the chat safe for attendees, and most sessions will have a live Q&A with the presenter or just an extended chat session for socialization after the video premieres. Please put presentations on your public address system in your head, or picture whatever means y'all use to broadcast information, so that folk don't need to fight over front to hear the information presented. None of our sessions are intended for the children members of your system. Please have someone babysit your youngest members so that they are occupied and happy during the conference, and they are safe from any advanced or uncomfortable topics. We will try to put content warnings in the video descriptions, but we cannot mind your triggers. That's an inside job. So please, if you feel uncomfortable at any time, feel free to disengage and do self-care. The videos will be up forever, and you can watch them, or watch them again later, when you're ready. Lastly, due to circumstances outside everyone's control, some presenters may have submitted late, and the schedule may be changing at the last minute. Please check the schedule frequently and make sure that you are aware of the latest changes on the schedule so that you aren't waiting for a session that's not about to happen, or you don't miss something added late to the schedule. This conference is free, open to the public, and sessions are already going to be available after the conference. Donations are more than welcome, as are community sponsors. If you'd like to support our conference in the future, please check out our website for donation and sponsor information. While it is low cost to run, we do have expenses, and the conference organizers would rather not both take our time and our money to support the conference. Speaking of sponsors, we would like to thank the Plural Association for donating their executive director's time, their volunteers' resources, and endless labor to the conference. Similarly, our time is being donated by our company, Eclectic Tech LLC, which is the umbrella over Liberated Life Coaching and kinhost.org. The time spent on this conference is a very worthy donation. We love y'all, and we want to see everyone's lives improved across the board. That said, we'd like to wish you all a wonderful conference. Let's introduce our keynote spokesplural. New Upsilon Xi, better known as the Sorority, or as we like to call them, the Ladies, are a plural sisterhood based in the United States. They describe their own experience of plurality as multiplicity. In the past, the ladies did not believe in DID because of how it was portrayed by both the media and mainstream academia as both rare and bizarre. Their disbelief ceased, and their understanding began when they found a radically different perspective. Discovering they were plural or multiple wasn't as much of a shock compared to their surprise at finding out other people were not. The Sorority are now activists both on and offline, advocating for the plural right to community, which has been historically denied to plurals, specifically those plurals with DID and OSDD. In their professional life, they oversee state-level mental health care policies. They are open in their plurality to their coworkers, colleagues, and counterparts. Without further interruption or lecture, we present the Sorority.
Hello, welcome everyone to Extraordinary Normalcy. My name's Pride, and I'm joined here today by my sisters Mercy and Liberty. Individually, our pronouns are all she, her, and collectively they, them. The three of us are members of New Upsilon Xi, a plural sisterhood of 18 women based in the US, better known as a sorority. We believe our origins to be of our own plurality to be trauma-based. However, our overall belief systems about the nature of plurality in general and other related phenomena often lean towards the neurodiversity paradigm. So although we meet the criteria for MPD under DSM-3, there are no available plurality diagnoses in the current DSM for which we would qualify. Our own interpretation of dissociative identity disorder is as something one has rather than something one is. I strongly emphasize this reflects only our own understanding and interpretation and does not intend to speak for those who may hold a different truth. Before we begin, please bear with me as we feel the need to make the following disclaimers. Based on our past experiences with others often misinterpreting or misrepresenting our words, these disclaimers are unfortunately necessary. First, the intended audience are members of or persons closely affiliated with the plural community. All are welcome. Second, this is an advanced session. Here, advanced means the presenters assume members of the audience are already knowledgeable of familiar terms, concepts, and history of the plural community. If you're new to any of this and wish to learn more about those things, there are other presentations better suited for that purpose. Third, members of our system have our own terminology, using words different from those which may be more familiar. For purposes of this presentation, we will use some more familiar terms, even though we ourselves do not use them. Fourth, stated, unless indicated otherwise, usage of the pronoun we does not refer to or imply anyone else other than the presenters. Fifth, stated, unless indicated otherwise, usage of the pronoun you does not refer to or imply members of the audience. You, members of the audience, decide what is true for yourselves. Now, a note on how we speak of certain terminology. It may seem that we use the terms plural and plurality and multiple multiplicity interchangeably. However, this is intentional and context-specific. This reflects our understanding of multiplicity as a form of plurality. For us, plurality refers to the entire spectrum of experiences or states of being, which could be described as manyness, or being more than one. We describe plurality first and foremost as a way of being in and relating to the world. We use multiple and multiplicity in reference to a specific region of the plural spectrum. This region is marked by the presence of more distinction and differentiation between system members, who are often able to switch in and out of the front. We identify politically and culturally as plural and describe our experience and ourselves as multiple. Content warnings for this session are: we take a stance on psychiatry, which is very critical of certain so-called best practices regarding treatment of plurals. If you find solace in the wisdom of medical professionals, you may not like this. You will hear medical professionals openly calling DID fake and actively engaging in plural erasure. You will hear criticism of the current state of discourse amongst plurals online, and there will be a brief mention of eating disorders unrelated to the body of the presentation. I'd like to start out my section of this presentation with a story. Our system's part in plural activism has been joining efforts to create spaces where plurals can meet each other, visit, and create communities of our own. Over the course of 3 summers and 5 conferences, we and 2 other systems embarked on a journey into the offline plural community to do exactly this. It was through a series of caucuses reserved for anyone identifying as more than one or anyone who is questioning their singularity. At each and every caucus, and in other instances, a common refrain we often hear is, "I've never met anyone else like myself before." One particularly meaningful episode from these caucuses was the meeting of 2 systems who attended the host conference as part of a delegation from their hometown, where they had known each other and worked together for more than 20 years, yet had no idea of each other's plurality until they both attended the same caucus that very evening. For others, it was the first time being able to talk about the plurality outside the context of a therapist's office, let alone amongst other plurals. Simply being in a room together with members of their own tribe was something they had been denied. It was on its surface nothing exceptional. It was people meeting people. It was normal. And yet for those in it, the experience was quite profound. Another episode consisted of a spontaneous post-caucus house party back at the apartment we were renting. I would estimate there are about 15 systems there, a singlet spouse, and an infant of indeterminate count. I sat there, watching other people eat pizza and mingle, and I thought of all the plurals who have never met anyone else like themselves. I sat there, watching other people like me being normal, together, and it was extraordinary. It was so profoundly normal. I stopped myself there and asked, why though? What prevents this sort of thing from happening and occurring more often? What keeps us apart? And for that we have to look at some of the codified, professionally endorsed guidelines by which the lives of many plurals are influenced. As you know, it can take plurals with DID many years to find quality, competent treatment. The current best practices for treatment for plurals is codified in the Treatment Guidelines for Adults with DID, published by the International Society for Study of Trauma and Dissociation, ISSTD, most recent edition being 2011. These paragraphs come from a section of the guidelines speaking to the unique difficulties that plurals with DID can experience in group therapy settings. For purposes of this presentation, we are not arguing against the validity of these statements or questioning whether they are clinically sound. The reason I'm focusing on them here is because they have to do with interactions between plurals, many, if not most, of whom have never met anyone else like them. Though they may be clinically sound, there are consequences and can even be considered cruel. A few carefully selected DID patients will be brought together. They would meet and get to know each other. Their interactions, though, would be predetermined and overseen by a medical professional. They would bring together carefully selected plurals and let them meet one another in a controlled environment. For many of them, it would be one of the first times they've ever met anyone like themselves. And then the professional tells them they can't socialise with one another outside the group. And should they dare gather together and support one another, they will be denied access to treatment, what took them years to find. Plurals with DID having to choose between a successful therapist of their own friends is just ghastly. The fear of losing access to treatment may perhaps be one reason why such independently organised gatherings of plurals are so rare, or at least infrequent, or not even considered in the first place. In the eyes of many experienced therapists, what we did at the house party might be seen as reckless and irresponsible. It wasn't group therapy or even a support group. It was socialising outside the context of therapy. Extraordinary normalcy is a term I use to describe the profound feeling of experiencing something considered so normal, even routine and banal to the society in which it's occurring by individuals who have been denied or deprived of such experiences for a number of different reasons in a variety of contexts. Extraordinary normalcy is thus only a symptom or sign that there are other forces at work. What allows us to be so easily and readily disconnected to such a degree when things considered normal, like spending time with friends, are rendered extraordinary? They would then be expressly prohibited from socializing with each other outside the context of therapeutic, professional, supervised settings. Were there to be any socializing outside the group, what would be the consequences of such a bold act of defiance? I imagine it would involve no longer having access to the only people they could identify with. What then would they be left with? Would these outcasts form their own self-help group? If they did, they could very well lose the experienced therapist again, that they've been spending years trying to find. Having to choose between these two things is in itself counter-therapeutic. Though these are only guidelines, they are only addressing group therapy, the overall impression for less experienced clinicians and knowledgeable laypeople is that plurals interacting with plurals is something to be frowned upon. This scattering and isolation can be understood as a form of institutional oppression unique to plurals that I have named dispersion. Dispersion then leads to the myth in the general public and less informed professionals that since DID is so rare, there are not enough of us to mount an active resistance. The great irony here, though, is that ISSTD's own numbers demonstrate there are more than enough of us to form our own country. Now, I will now turn it over to Liberty to illustrate exactly what I mean by that. Hello everyone, Liberty here. So for the next few slides, I will be laying out some specifics to keep in mind that will put everything that follows in perspective. I'll then be reading from one of my articles from the series Talking Magic Tumblr to literally illustrate Pride's point. So, as she was saying, the prevalence of DID comes straight from the ISSTD itself. Many studies conducted over the years has described as being between 1 to 3% of the population. But this can be misleading if we were to jump right into my illustration, so some things need to be clear. First, though, all but one of those studies were done under the DSM-4, not under the current criteria under DSM-5. The most recent study you see there in 2008, the DSM-5 was not published until 2013. So when I'm talking about 1 to 3% meeting the criteria for DID, these are the criteria I'm talking about. The presence of 2 or more distinct identities or personality states, each with its own relatively enduring pattern of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about the environment and self. B. At least 2 of these identities or personality states recurrently take control of the person's behavior. C. Inability to recall important personal information that is too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. D. The disturbance is not due to the direct physiological effects of a substance, example, blackouts or chaotic behavior during alcohol intoxication, or a general medical condition, example, complex partial seizures. And note that in children, the symptoms are not attributable to imaginary playmates or other fantasy play. So, keeping that in mind, the 1 to 3% represents those plurals who are or were diagnosable under DSM-4. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about the 1 to 3% of the population. So here's my article. Dear Tumblr, it's Liberty again. So, knowing what we know, 1 to 3% of the population, which population are they talking about? So we will start with the population of the United States of America, which on February 5th, 2020 was 329,269,446. So that is the population that we'll be taking from because, again, ISSTD did not specify which population. So what does 1% of that look like? 1% of the population would be plurals with DID, would be 3,292,694. In terms of population, it would be the 134th most populous country in the world, beating out Mongolia. It would be the 30th most populous state in the territory, surpassing Iowa. And by the way, Iowa is known as a swing state. If there is such a thing as a plural voting bloc, we could have major influence on U.S. presidential elections. It would be the 3rd most populous U.S. city, much larger than Chicago. Chicago is the city you'll see in the background there, nighttime skyline. You could imagine that every single body in that entire picture was plural and had DID, and you'd be correct if 1% of the population was accurate. So in terms of land area, how big would that be? The average population density of the United States is 92.2 people per square mile. So given the same distribution, the total land area would be 35,574.83 square miles. If it were a state, it would be the 39th largest, greater than Maine. If it were country, it would be the 110th largest, surpassing Jordan. So, with that in mind, let's see what 3% would be. 3% would be 9,878,083. It would be the 92nd most populous country in the world, larger than Hungary. It would be the 11th most populous state in the U.S., greater than New Jersey. And it would be the most populous city in the U.S., surpassing New York City by over 1 million people. Again, in the background there, you'll see a picture of Manhattan. You could imagine that every single body in that entire picture was plural and had DID. And you'd be correct if ISSTD is accurate and the population they're describing is the United States of America. So how big in terms of landmass would that be? Using the same distribution per square mile as the rest of it, the landmass would be 106,724.5 square miles. If that were state, it would be the 8th largest state, beating out to Colorado. And if it was a country, it would be the 74th largest country in the world, greater than Burkina Faso. So, to recap, at 1% of the US population, it would be more people than Chicago and bigger than Maine. At 3%, it would be more people than New York City and larger than Colorado. So that's just the US population, if that's what's being described. What about the world population? World population on February 9th, 2020 was 7,629,411,780. This chart right here is a proportional chart. The total number in there is the world population, and each country has its own section, the largest proportional to their population. That's why you'll see India and China on the side over there are very large, and you can also see the US and Brazil also have substantially large portions of that map. We'll come back to this later, but let's go ahead and look at 1% of the world population. So 1% of the world population would be the most populous state in the Union. It would also be have more people in it than Thailand, which would be 68,863,514. Significantly larger than that. You can see the background there. That's Bangkok. You could imagine that every single body in that picture was plural with DID and the entire country beyond it. If ISSTD is describing 1% of the world population. So how big in terms of square miles? In terms of square miles, the population distribution in the world is 36.66 bodies per square mile. That would mean a land mass of over 2,804,015.27 square miles. It would be the 7th largest country in the world, somewhere between India and Australia. So, ready for this? 3% of the world's population. That would be nearly 229 million systems, which is more than the population of Brazil by about 20 million. That picture in the background is downtown Sao Paulo. We can wave at some of our friends there, but if we're looking down at space, you could imagine that everybody in that picture was plural and had DID, plus the entire country beyond it. So let's go back to square mileage. Using the same population distribution as the rest of the world, it would be the 2nd largest country in the world, larger than Antarctica, not a country by the way. It would only be surpassed by Russia by about 6 million square miles. So to recap, at 1% of the world population, a plural nation would be a subcontinent with more people than Thailand. And at 3% of the population, it would be an entire continent with more people than Brazil. So going back to this map, this chart, where you can see all the countries with all the different sizes of the population proportionate to one another, and then there's 1 and 3% right there. 1 to 3%, Thailand and Brazil, compared to all the rest of it, is still matters. It's still significant. And again, this whole time, all I've been talking about are plurals with DID as described under DSM-4. It's not that they're the only ones that count. It's the only ones that can be counted. The only ones that can have a diagnostic code attached to them and billed for insurance. That's it. The 1 to 3% of any population, US or anything else, are only the ones that can be counted. So what about plurals in general? What about people who met the criteria for MPD but not DID later on? What about people who only meet the first criteria of MPD, which is being plural? We have 1 to 3% that meets a specific population. But what about everyone else? I think a conservative guess would, because I've heard upwards of 7, but a conservative guess, I think, would be 5%. So, 5% of the population of the world, and we're talking again about non-diagnosable versus undiagnosed. For the US population, it would be more people than Pennsylvania and Oklahoma combined. And for the world, it would be over 1 million people more than the United States of America in 2040. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mercy. Hello, this is Mercy speaking. I'm addressing the audience directly today. I'll demonstrate plural erasure and how we've all been complicit in it. I assume you're all familiar with what I call the line. The line is as follows. Dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Sound familiar? How many times have we said or heard some variation of this? The most comprehensive and authoritative version is as follows. DID was called multiple personality disorder up until 1994, when the name was changed to reflect a better understanding of the condition. Here is the full text of that line, going into a bit more detail as to how their understanding was better. You will find this full quote on Psychology Today, one of the most reputable journals in the field. There are lots of things in Psychology Today, including articles. Here's one such article. Published in January of 2014, which was many years after DSM-4 and less than a year after DSM-5. And its content was deemed worth republishing in the Huffington Post in April of the same year. For the sake of time, I am only reading excerpts. Multiple personality disorder has always been controversial and contagious. We are lucky that MPD is now in one of its quiescent phases, but it will almost certainly make a comeback before very long. Recurring false epidemics have occurred several different times during the last century. The trigger is usually either a widespread copycatting of a popular movie or book, or the fevered preachings of a charismatic MPD guru, or both. In every single instance, I discovered that the alternate personalities had been born under the tutelage of an enthusiastic and naive therapist, or in imitation of a friend, or after seeing a movie, or upon joining a multiples chat group, or some combination. Having seen hundreds of patients who claim to house multiple personalities, I have concluded that the diagnosis is always, or at least almost always, a fake, even though the patients claiming it are usually, but not always, sincere. And so I'd like to take a moment and rhetorically ask, what is the relevance of my part of this presentation? Many people disbelieve in DID and MPD. What's one more professional professing it doesn't exist? What does this have anything to do with the line? If you would like to believe the line, and reasoning behind it is the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, you aren't going to like this. The article continues. As chair of the DSM task force, I was convinced that it was an iatrogenically inspired diagnosis inappropriately inflicted upon vulnerable patients by the poorly trained therapists who came away from their silly weekend workshops armed with an MPD hammer that seemed to fit every patient nail. My own inclination was to wise up therapists and protect vulnerable patients by simply omitting MPD from the DSM. But my hands were tied. We had put down strict rules requiring high evidentiary evidence before any change could be made in the DSM-4. This was intended to prevent arbitrary changes by containing the diagnostic exuberance that typified the experts who were engaged in revising the manual. Any suggestion to expand the system required compelling evidence, but the sword cut both ways. Any change to reduce the system, like eliminating MPD, required equally compelling evidence. I couldn't rid DSM of MPD because I had to follow my own rules. The best we could do to reduce the popularity of MPD and inspire caution in its diagnosis was to fill its text description with all the cogent arguments against it. The name of the article you just heard is called Multiple Personality, Mental Disorder, Myth, or Metaphor. The author is Dr. Alan Francis, MD, former chairman of the DSM-4 task force. Alan's not a bad guy. He's just honest. He did what he did mostly out of genuine concern over dangers this community is all too familiar with, namely the kind of damage that can happen when over-enthusiastic and underqualified professionals treat patients with DID. He also did it because he thinks we are some kind of socially constructed delusion. Either way, he could have done a lot worse if he hadn't followed his own rules in spite of his own beliefs. I respect that. If he'd had his way, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion, or at least we might be having a very different discussion altogether. The reason his words are relevant to the topic at hand is that the reasoning behind the line "we have been fed" isn't entirely truthful. Alan is very open and truthful and unapologetically honest when it comes to the reasons behind why the change occurred. This chart here shows the progression of the plurality-related aspects from MPD in DSM-3 to DID in DSM-5. You'll see that there are 3 criteria for MPD. There's more than one of you. You're different from each other, and you can switch. That's it. The diagnostic criteria for multiple personality disorder all added up to being multiple. MPD and multiplicity were treated as the exact same thing. If you were multiple, you had MPD. If you had MPD, you are multiple. Now, all those different criteria have made their way over into criterion A of DID. They're all still there. It's just that now it has been separated out from the rest of the criteria. And it is now written in a way as a doctor would describe multiplicity to an insurance company. And that's not the only difference. The current state of DID in the DSM is, in our opinion, a good one. They have separated out multiplicity into a single A criterion that can stand on its own without rising to the level of a disorder, as is required by criterion C, addressing clinically significant distress and impairment, as you'll see down there in the red box. What this means is that now plurals who need help can get help, and plurals that don't need help won't be told they do need help simply because they are plural. Continuing to pathologize plurality and multiplicity as though they are mental illnesses in their own right is misinformed and out of touch. MPD in DSM-3 only had 3 criteria, all related to multiplicity. Today, only 1, criterion of 5, is related to multiplicity. To equate DID with multiplicity, or MPD, misses 4/5 of the whole disorder. DID is not renamed MPD. If that's all it was, then yes, a diagnosis of DID would be the requirement to be multiple. But it's not simply multiplicity on its own, as you can see. Multiplicity is now the first criterion of DID. You don't need to have DID to be multiple. You have to be multiple to have DID. If you are multiple and don't experience amnesia, there is still OSDD1B. And if you're not fully multiple yet still experience amnesia, there's OSDD1A. Either way, in all 3 instances of the current plurality-related mental disorders, the symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in one or more important areas of functioning. Another major diversion from previous DSM is that the 5th now allows for reporting by the patients themselves or others. So when the line must be said, more honest and accurate ways of saying it need to be provided. Here are just some ways, either you're talking about DID or MPD, could easily be done. I prefer the commonly mistaken 4, option there, but also the descendant of, precedent of. All of these are more accurate than what the line typically is. However, the best way of saying it, because this is the reasoning behind it that we have today, would be like this. Multiplicity existed in DSM as its own mental disorder up until 1994, when it was revised and incorporated into dissociative identity disorder to reduce its popularity and focus more on the disordering aspects associated with the condition. So there, that's better. And now I will turn it back over to Liberty. Okay, so thank you, Mercy, for whatever it is that was. So back to you, audience. If you would like to learn more about DID, you can kind of go back to what we've been talking for this entire time about the line. So Mercy just walked us through kind of what's in the Psychology Today half of it. I'm going to walk you through the other part of it, the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH. It's not NIM. It's not about talking rats. It's an actual place. And it is the lead federal agency on mental health research. There's a screenshot of their website right there. As you can see, it's got a lot of information on DID. And that arrow there is pointing to where it says to all the different things that you can learn about the mental health disorders that they research. So go ahead and click on that, and it will bring you to this page. Now, it's a little bit difficult to navigate. It's a government website and all. So you would think it'd be right there between eating disorders and disruptive mood disorders, but it's not. So you're going to have to do a little work on your part. You're going to have to use the search engine on the website. And so if you're not familiar with how to internet, this may be a little tricky, so I'm going to help you out here. So you're going to want to click your cursor inside the search bar, and you're going to want to type in dissociative identity disorder. Now, make sure all 3 words are spelled correctly, and make sure that you type all 3 words in the first place, and that all 3 of them are in this order. Dissociative is first, identity is second, and finally, disorder. Those 3 words, don't mess this up. Okay, and now you're going to hit click, okay? And it's going to bring you to the search results for dissociative identity disorder on NIMH. Now, ignore that first one, okay? Because they don't know what they're talking about. They're the government, and they're not really, the experts on this stuff. But anyway, so ignore bipolar disorder. All right, that the recommended search hit right there. Ignore that. You're gonna want to click on the one right below it where the red arrow is pointing. Okay, it's the only place on the entire website where you will find the words dissociative identity and disorder in that order, spelled correctly. All right, that's the only place you will find it. So go ahead and click on schizophrenia. And so it will take you to the schizophrenia page. And if you'd like to learn just a little bit more, knowing a little bit more about it, you're going to want to download the full book. So you can go ahead and download it right there where that red arrow is. And that'll give you a free book from the government. And it contains everything that the U.S. American federal government wants you, yes, you, and the entire internet to know about dissociative identity disorder on the very first page. And it's right there in the middle of the page. So allow me to read that for you. Schizophrenia is not dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder or split personality. While some of the signs may seem similar on the surface, gotta love that alliteration, people with dissociative identity disorder have 2 or more distinct identities which alternately take control of them. Now, you may have heard how I, read that a little differently. That's just 2 sentences right there. That first whole sentence is in bold. That sentence is in bold, so they really want you to know that. And that's where it talks about how they want you to know that schizophrenia isn't DID, formerly called multiple personality disorder. All right. Now, in that second sentence, you notice that that you heard distinct identities in a very distinct way. That's because those 2 words are in italics. So you've got italics and bold text separated out in its own little blue box with 2 sentences about DID on the entire webpage, and that is all that they have, and it is never spoken of ever again. So, the line will bring you there, to NIMH. And this is a problem. So when we tell people to educate themselves about dissociative identity disorder, and they take a cue from the line, which has Psychology Today and NIMH as different places to go to learn about it, the problem is they probably will. They probably will go to NIMH. They probably will go to Psychology Today. And that's a problem, because you've seen what they have. Schizophrenia isn't DID. They don't want you to know that DID is not schizophrenia. That would be the case if DID had its own page. They want you to know that schizophrenia is not DID because it's only found on the page of a completely different disorder. So where is it on their priority list? So even if they don't do any research on DID, this is all the educational material they have available on their website. And isn't this where the whole statement on MPD is now DID came from? So the quality of educational material that on DID that the most reputable sources are supposed to have is, well, mistaking DID and schizophrenia is kind of like mistaking Star Wars and Star Trek. That's really about it, and that's the best thing I can describe what is available out there if we go only by the line. And I'm going to hand it right back to Mercy for a little more about DSM and the role it plays in our community. So back to Mercy. Thank you. This is Mercy again. Do you know why they changed DSM's numbering from Roman to Arabic numerals? It was so that updates could be released more frequently. DSM-5 is already obsolete. Below Pikachu is a screenshot of DSM 5.1, published in September of 2016, clarifying a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder must contain all 3 items in the first criterion. Did anyone professionally diagnosed with ASD who only met partial criteria at the time of their diagnosis effectively lose their diagnosis? Maybe some did. According to various internet people, those folks were never autistic to begin with and can't claim that identity anymore. That makes no sense. What code your doctor uses to get paid does not change the reality of your experience. This is the same for plurals who had DID or DDNOS under DSM-4, but neither DID nor OSDD under DSM-5, because it's not causing clinically significant distress. It was the same for plurals, like us, who would have lost a professional diagnosis of MPD had we ever been diagnosed with it. Again, the first criterion of DID is how a doctor would describe multiplicity to an insurance company. Its presence or absence in a billing guide does not erase the reality of you. DSM is not magic. If APA removed DID, no one in the plural community would disappear. I can say this with a good degree of confidence. There are other communities we know of who were united by things once listed in that book. Those things were removed, yet now their reality is part of established society. They did not disappear. There is still a focus on their distinct healthcare needs, which have their own budgets for treatment and research. All things considered, they've done fairly well for themselves after people no longer considered them mentally ill by default. There are other aspects to that topic best saved for another presentation. We are not anti-psychiatry. Psychiatry is anti-us. They've changed the definition of plurality-related mental disorders with every edition of DSM. There is no reason to believe they won't do it again, and if they could take it out entirely, they would do so. It's an identity crisis waiting to happen. So where does that all bring us? Where do we go from here? This conference, like the one before it, is yet another road mark in our community's journey. The plural community is fast approaching a critical mass, a point of no return, after which our ratio will become impossible. It has been here, on this social media platform, whose sole purpose is visibility, that the greatest strides have been made. Videos with millions of views and channels with scores of thousands of subscribers are making this possible. It is at this pivotal time that we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. When I look at the state of the Plural community, especially that online, I see a great deal of disunion. I see rifts occurring, but I don't see exclusion. I see isolation. I see self-imposed isolation. I see systems intentionally cutting themselves off from the greater Plural community over reasons that are at their core ideologically driven. Ideologies whose core text is a billing guide subject to change without consultation. People are entitled to their own communities, but communities based on ideological purity last only as long as the most orthodox and dogmatic members. When the core ideological text upon which they base their validity makes apostates of true believers, what then? Building communities based on identities dictated by health insurance companies will fail. Whatever words you may choose to describe your experiences as being more than one, and identify yourself as such, there is one truth that does unite all of us. A core belief based on a truth that no one can take from us, a truth whose time has come. We are not alone. Thank you.